The Murder of Hae Min Lee and the Case Against Adnan Syed. On January 13, 1999, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee, a popular high school senior from Baltimore County, went missing after school. Nearly a month later, on February 9th, her body was discovered half buried in Leakin Park, a wooded area on the outskirts of the city. The medical examiner determined she had been killed by manual strangulation. Suspicion quickly turned to her ex-boyfriend, 17-year-old Adnan Syed, after an anonymous tip and police interviews pointed in his direction. Syed was arrested and charged with Hae's murder, despite proclaiming his innocence from the start. In 2000, based on the evidence presented, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. This initial conviction rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, the testimony of a friend and cell phone records, with no physical evidence directly tying Syed to the crime. At trial, prosecutors argued that Syed was a jealous ex-boyfriend who murdered Hae in a fit of rage. The state's case relied heavily on the story told by a 19-year-old acquaintance named Jay Wilds. Jay claimed that Syed had strangled Hae in a 21-minute window after school on January 13th, then called Jay for help in disposing of the body. Jay further claimed he assisted Syed in burying Hae's body in Leakin Park that evening. Jay was able to lead police to Hae's abandoned car, which increased his credibility. That discovery, something only someone involved or told by the killer could know, helped solidify Syed as the prime suspect. Aside from Jay's account, the only other evidence was a log of Syed's cell phone records from that day, which prosecutors argued matched Jay's timeline. No DNA or fingerprints from Syed were found on Hae's body or at the crime scene. Nevertheless, the jury found the case compelling. Even during the trial, there were clear issues with the prosecution's narrative. Jay's testimony changed with every retelling. He gave multiple conflicting versions about where he saw Hae's body, where the murder occurred, and the timeline of events. His account shifted from the parking lot of a strip mall to the Best Buy, and even to other streets. His descriptions of the events of that day evolved as the investigation progressed, raising serious doubts about his credibility. Yet his inconsistencies were downplayed, and the parts that aligned with the prosecution's theory were emphasized. Jay, a potential suspect himself, received a plea deal for his cooperation. The cell phone evidence was also flawed. The prosecution presented records of incoming calls as if they could accurately determine Syed's location, particularly calls that pinged a tower near Leakin Park. However, the cell provider's documentation explicitly stated that incoming calls could not be used to reliably determine location. This critical information was in the police file, but never clearly presented to the jury. Without that evidence, the already shaky foundation of Jay's story lost its supposed corroboration. Crucially, Syed had a potential alibi that was never introduced in court. A classmate, Asia McLean, said she saw and spoke with Syed at the public library during the very time frame the prosecution alleged the murder occurred. The library was next to their school, and Asia even wrote letters to Syed after his arrest, affirming her recollection. Syed's defense attorney never contacted her or introduced her testimony in court. This omission was later deemed a violation of Syed's right to effective legal representation. Forensic evidence also contradicted the timeline. The lividity patterns on Hae's body suggested she had been lying face down for several hours after death. However, according to Jay, the body was buried within a few hours of the murder in a side position. The forensic detail about the body's lividity pattern suggested she had remained in one position much longer than Jay's timeline allowed, indicating the body may have been stored elsewhere before burial. This discrepancy was never addressed at trial. The prosecution's case against Syed was built more on narrative than on hard evidence. There was no eyewitness to the crime, no surveillance footage, and no forensic evidence directly linking Syed to the murder. The entire case rested on the words of one man, bolstered by misrepresented cell phone data. Even more troubling, prosecutors failed to share information with the defense about other potential suspects who had motive and opportunity to kill Hae. One of these individuals had allegedly threatened Hae in the past, claiming he would make her disappear. Another had a history of violence against women. The defense at trial was weak, and Syed's attorney, once highly respected, was in declining health at the time. She was disbarred for unrelated misconduct shortly after the trial. Key opportunities were missed, including the use of the library Alibi and challenging the reliability of the cell phone records. In 2016, a court found Syed's legal representation deficient, acknowledging that failure to contact the alibi witness could have affected the trial's outcome. For years, the case faded into obscurity until the 2014 launch of the podcast Serial, which revisited the evidence and questioned Syed's conviction. The podcast uncovered inconsistencies in Jay's stories, doubts about the cell phone data, the forgotten alibi, and the absence of physical evidence. Millions of listeners followed the story, which sparked public fascination and ignited online debates. Amateur sleuths pored over court transcripts and evidence, mapping out locations and challenging the prosecution's timeline. The podcast humanized Syed and introduced skepticism about the justice system. Many began to believe he was innocent, or at the very least, that the conviction was based on a deeply flawed process. The case became a cultural flashpoint, transforming from a local crime to an international topic. The podcast's influence even extended to legal motions that reopened the case years later. Not everyone welcomed the attention. Hae Min Lee's family expressed distress at having their personal tragedy turned into public entertainment. They felt the focus on Syed had overshadowed Hae's life and death. The family's pain was real, and their desire for justice was not easily reconciled with the swelling support for Syed. The widespread interest eventually had legal consequences. In 2016, a Maryland judge granted Syed a new trial due to his attorney's failure to contact the alibi witness. But in 2019, the Maryland Court of Appeals reversed that decision, citing procedural grounds. Syed remained in prison, having already served nearly 2 decades. In 2022, a new state's attorney reinvestigated the case and found serious problems with the original prosecution. They acknowledged the unreliable cell phone data and the existence of alternative suspects. The court vacated Syed's conviction, and he was released after 23 years. DNA testing conducted in the reinvestigation failed to link Syed to the crime scene. Shortly afterward, the charges were dropped. However, the legal journey didn't end there. In March 2023, the conviction was reinstated by an appellate court, not because of new evidence, but due to a procedural issue. Hae's family had not been given sufficient notice to attend the hearing that vacated the conviction. Although the conviction technically stood, prosecutors chose not to retry Syed, citing the lack of credible evidence. Syed was not returned to prison but was resentenced to time served under a juvenile resentencing law. The case of Adnan Syed continues to provoke intense debate. Some argue that Syed is an innocent man who was railroaded by a flawed system. Others believe the courts have caved to public pressure and let a guilty man go free. The truth may never be fully known, but what's clear is that the original investigation and prosecution were riddled with errors and omissions. The role of media has been central to this case. The podcast helped expose flaws in the legal process and gave voice to overlooked evidence, but it also blurred the lines between journalism and advocacy. It raised questions about how the court of public opinion can influence real legal outcomes. The handling of alternative suspects, the failure to disclose exculpatory evidence, the ineffective defense, and the manipulation of cell phone data all point to a justice system that too often prioritizes conviction over truth. The procedural reinstatement of Syed's conviction further complicates the narrative. He is neither fully exonerated nor imprisoned, occupying a legal gray area that reflects broader systemic dysfunction. The murder of Hae Min Lee and the prosecution of Adnan Syed illustrate the dangers of constructing a criminal case based on narrative rather than fact. It underscores how vulnerable the system is to error, especially when defense resources are lacking and prosecutors overlook or suppress key information. Syed's release may be viewed as a victory for justice reform advocates, but his continued legal status as a convicted murderer reflects the unresolved tensions at the heart of the case. The case has left a lasting imprint on the public imagination and the criminal justice landscape. It highlights the need for transparency, diligence, and humility in prosecuting crimes. Until the true circumstances of Hae Min Lee's death are definitively established, the case remains a haunting reminder that justice is not always as certain as a courtroom verdict suggests.